Welcome to another episode of HSF Conversations. Today, uh, Mr. Phillip Morgan and I, Matt Bracey, are going to be talking about The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. So, oftentimes these conversations revolve around ministry or theology, or I think our last conversation dealt with reflections on the election. But today we're going to talk about literature, and as I mentioned, particularly The Silmarillion. I recently, not too long ago, read for the first time The Silmarillion. Perhaps like some of you, when I was growing up, the Lord of the Rings movies by Peter Jackson came out. I, during the process of college, read the Lord of the Rings books and I loved them immensely. And then the next thing that you do, if you start to get into Tolkien often, is that you try to read the Silmarillion, or maybe you succeed in reading the Silmarillion. In any case, I didn't make it. I tried. Maybe I made it a few dozen pages, but I got lost in the details. It was too hard, perhaps. Its form was something I wasn't accustomed to, and so I eventually gave up. Well, for me, jump forward a couple of decades, I guess. I'm in the midst of my PhD program. I'm actually in the midst of writing my dissertation. And I made two promises to myself. When I finish my dissertation, I'm going to do two things. One, I promised myself I would sleep more because I wasn't sleeping like I should or wanted to. And the second thing I promised myself is that I would read good fiction. And I'd heard for a long time that Silmarillion, if you can just get it, is one of the best things you'll read. And so I thought, it's been a couple of decades. I'm going to try my hand at this thing again. Well, I guess it's been a decade and a half or so. So I tried my hand at it again, and I absolutely loved it. In a moment, I want us to talk about. Uh, through the course of this conversation, we're gonna get into the Silmarillion. We're gonna get into some of its themes. But first, I want us to talk about what are our individual experiences uh, hearing about the book, reading the book, our first impressions, and then advice on, if I'm someone who would like to read it, but it's hard, it's challenging. How do you successfully make your way through the Silmarillion? And if it takes all this work, why is it worth it anyway? So I'll tell more of my story in a minute in my first impressions. But I know you're someone who's read the Silmarillion, so tell us about your experience with it.
Yeah, I first read the book when I was in high school. My When I was in maybe middle school, friends of mine that I was close with were big fans of The Lord of the Rings and that were in my homeschool group. And so I got introduced to The Hobbit and to The Lord of the Rings through them. And I just loved The Hobbit and especially The Lord of the Rings. And I just read The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers and The Return of the King over and over and over again between the ages of 13 and 17. And then when I was 17, I was spent a year and a half at a private school, Christian school in the area, and I was making some new friends, and those were in the halcyon pre-internet days, at least for people of rural America, like I was. And so I didn't know about lots of things that were out in the world related to Tolkien, but I came into contact with a couple of guys in high school, David Pryor and James Cornelius, who had read the Silmarillion, or at least were familiar with it, and they were talking about it. And so I was thinking, well, I need to figure out what this is about. And I took my spending money and went to the used bookstore and found a copy of the Silmarillion. And I don't know what exactly had inspired me to do this. I don't know if I had picked it up earlier or if I got it at the same time. Whatever it was, that was very helpful is I also got a Tolkien companion. So again, in the pre-internet days, I couldn't just go to Google or Wikipedia to find answers for things if I got lost in a book. But there were already multiple authors had put out companions to the Tolkien world that functioned as um, like an encyclopedia. And so you could find people's names and place names. And that was extremely helpful when I started reading the Silmarillion, because it was indeed a a tough book to get into. He had, created his own languages, and they are used for proper names throughout the book. He has a very clear sense of geography that he does not explain to you. And the maps that are present in the book itself are of limited help. And especially my tiny little handheld copy that I had. And so the companion book was extremely helpful. But I did find it incredibly rich. It was very different than Lord of the Rings, but I had benefited from having read The Hobbit first and then going to Fellowship of the Ring. That's a shifting gears pretty significantly. And and so when I first started reading Lord of the Rings and it wasn't like The Hobbit, that was a little unsettling to me. But I powered through, and I found that I actually much preferred Lord of the Rings to The Hobbit. And so I kind of trusted in Tolkien in that regard. I was like, well, this is a different set, but I'm going to take what he's done with Lord of the Rings, and I'll assume that can be the same for this. And so I uh I read all the way through it, used the companion to help me keep up with the names. That was very complex, and also to kind of follow along the sections of the book, which aren't very clearly laid out exactly what he's doing in that regard. Um, the major takeaways I had from my first reading were this incredibly complex world building that he was capable of. And I know that he gets a lot of grief from people who complain about all the geography sections in the Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit and in Silmarillion. It's even more in depth. I'm not a big person into geography necessarily, but I actually always really enjoyed those sections. I found it fascinating that you could describe a landscape in such a precise and clear way, but also to make it beautiful. He clearly loves what he's writing about. And then the characters were incredibly deep. These themes would run through the entire book, which spans thousands of years. And what seemed like an insignificant thing in one place turned out to be one of the major turning points of all history in his world in a later place. And so that really struck me. And then there was good romance, and a 17-year-old boy who's trying to figure out romance and how do you win the heart of a girl. That was very helpful to kind of see some of those themes there as well. So um, that was my first experience with it. I soon thereafter got an audio book on CD of the book, and when I was delivering pizzas for the next 10 years, I listened to the Silmarillion on audio probably another 10 or 12 times. So it was a major part of my teens and 20s.
Did you take your romance cues from the Dark Elf?
No, not from the Dark Elf.
Okay.
No. Baron and Luthien,
Okay.
that story was particularly influential for me.
It occurs to me that perhaps I should give a little bit of background to this book, and you can add in if you'd like, if you think I characterize it wrongly. But Tolkien is born in the late 1800s. He is in the First World War. He is working on stories that will eventually be part of the Middle Earth mythos all the way back in the 19 teens. And so along and along, he's working on just all these stories, and eventually they come to be part of this world of Middle Earth. Well, he doesn't publish The Hobbit until 19 and I think 37. I think that's right. And then he publishes The Lord of the Rings in the 1950s. And it's one small part of a much larger tale. The uh, so he's publishing things along and along, but he's just got bukus of stuff that he's written that never sees published form in his lifetime because he's such a perfectionist. And so it's the task of his son to make sense, to gather and to synthesize and to collate all of his work into a publishable form. And so the Silmarillion is an early manifestation of that. there is the evolution of all kinds of stories that he wrote, and in some cases put together, in some cases didn't. But he's working on stories, and they're distinct, but then they come to be overlapping, and so he begins to put them together. Tolkien does, but this is a process that takes place over the course of decades, and so Tolkien's son is doing this work, trying to understand the various forms and versions of these various stories. But then after the Silmarillion comes out in the 70s, you've got a series of publications that comes out in the 80s, uh, where he's giving different versions of these stories. But then, in more recent decades, he has given fuller accounts of some of the stories that actually occur in 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 the context of the Silmarillion. So that's a little bit about where it comes from and how it's published. But in terms of the form of the Silmarillion, I think part of the reason that it's so can be challenging to get into is that it's not a form that we're accustomed to, and it's just something otherworldly. So you've got, say, just popular fiction, popular fantasy, which, some people can read and get into. But then you have something that's quite a bit more has a bit more gravitas than that. It's popular in a certain manner of speaking, but it's got deeper gravity. And I would say the Lord of the Rings are like that. There's a popular element to it. It's accessible, but it's grounded and it's serious. Well, the Silmarillion, it's a step or three beyond that. It really doesn't read even like a more formal fantasy. It kind of reads like an epic, like something you would get from Homer,
Yeah.
or one of these ancient Greek or Roman epics. So, if the Lord of the Rings is covering a relatively short period of time
Mm.
over the course of, say, 1,500 pages or 1,000 pages, depending on your version, this story is covering literally tens of thousands of years over the course of so it's much more expansive in scope, both in terms of its chronology and in terms of its geography. That doesn't mean he's not able to get deeply into certain themes, but it's much more epic in its scope.
Mhm.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I think that's
Description.
right. And well, the other thing that's going on there is that Tolkien is an Oxford Don who teaches philology.
Mm-hmm.
So he is a student of historical languages, and he is fascinated by, especially if we think of him growing up at the turn of the 20th century, he is fascinated by the Romantics' attempts to reclaim folk culture and folk stories, and he is trying to craft a folk culture, a folk story for England that would ground it in something very deep, and he's trying to write a modern day myth. And so it's a very complex thing that he's doing. And part of why it is can be very difficult to kind of enter into the first time if you're only accustomed to popular literature is this is a very academically robust creation. It's beautiful, it's artistic, but it is not light. And whether or not you don't have to know philology to understand it, but that is embedded in every aspect of it. And so, the whole idea of creating languages, but then that he recognizes languages always develop in a context. And so there's a people and there's a geography that are tied to these things. So it's not just one language he creates. He creates a multitude of languages that make up this entire world that he's created. And so that just becomes a little overwhelming the first time through because he just assumes he doesn't give you any he doesn't put any introductory material to it. He doesn't explain this is what I'm doing. It's just boom, here you go. Here's 10 names that aren't in English, that aren't connected to any, uh, human language. And and I'm just going to use these as though you know what they are.
So the Silmarillion is, among other things, an attempt to give England um, a proper myth. And there's an extent to which it is the story in a fictionalized, romantic, epic way. It's the story of the English people. But if it's going to be the story of the English people, and to a certain degree, perhaps you could say it's in some ways it's the story of man, but it particularized man, England. Um, it's got to have all the elements that make human beings what they are. Therefore, it's going to have peoples and it's going to have geographies and it's going to have different cultures and it's going to see those cultures sort of crash into one another. And it's going to have beautiful things and it's going to have horrible things. It's going to have things gone wrong. It's going to have pride and it's going to have redemption and it's going to have love and it's going to have love perverted. And I mean, all of the themes that you see in, say, the history of humanity, you're going to see represented here. So for the folks who want to complain about the geography, perhaps you could say that you don't have human beings as you have them, but for their geography,
Right.
because geography makes us who it's part of what makes up the context of who we are.
That's right. Yeah, and I think the other thing that struck me as a young person, not knowing anything about Tolkien, like I just didn't know anything about him at the time. But I remember also reading this and thinking, this is kind of like reading the Old Testament in its form. And that struck me as very interesting because I've read a lot of literature and very ancient literature. It doesn't really read like the Old Testament. There's something that's a little bit off from that. But it's very interesting how much it feels very similar in that regard. And part of that's because it opens with the creation account. So, I mean, that's part of it. But it's a very interesting kind of attempt at explaining the whole history of man or of the worlds and its relationship to the gods or God, and how that works out. And so I found that to be particularly interesting as well. And I never took it as though he was offering this as a alternative, but rather I did know that he was a Christian. He's a friend of C.S. Lewis, so I knew that was there. But especially as I've gotten older, I've realized he is exploring um, pre-modern, maybe pre-enlightenment ways of thinking about the nature of reality as God created it. And uh, it is, I think, particularly helpful for us in a modern age to get that counterbalance.
Mm. Mm. What do you think of this? Occasionally you might hear someone criticize, say, Tolkien and Lewis and all these various people for having pagan elements in their fantasies. So what do you think of this idea? If this story, if the story of Middle Earth is the story of England, and if the story of England is the story of a people who were pagan, but then as Christianity spread, uh, Christianity began to challenge the barbarism
Mhm.
of those who would have been living in Northern Europe, say our ancestors. There's ways in which this story is kind of a synthesis of those ideas because there are certain elements that you could correlate to certain pagan elements, Norse mythology and things like that. But it's as it were trying to, I don't know that this is the right term, but it's analogous to the light of the gospel coming into the dark recesses of Northern Europe. So you've got these pagan elements, but then they're being Christianized and they're being turned into something that's truer.
Yeah, I think Tolkien and Lewis both. Well, I mean, I don't think they very clearly had said as much that they were doing this. They were trying to suss out these pagan gods of Europe. They weren't God. And people worship them idolatrously. So that's bad, obviously. On the other hand, they aren't just idols. There's something deeper going on with the myths associated with those pagan gods that seems to be trying to explain the nature of reality. How do the elements relate to one another? How do these elements submit to the order of the universe? What happens when they get out of whack? What happens when man gets crossways with these powers within the universe? And they're trying to figure out what exactly it is that they're trying to say in the pagan world. What is the deeper truth underneath the stories, underneath the idolatry? And how could we understand that in light of the gospel and in light of scripture? And so Tolkien does this really wonderfully in the Silmarillion. C.S. Lewis does it very beautifully in Till We Have Faces and in his space trilogy, Out of the Side of the Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength, which have become my those are my three favorite books by him right now. They've just come to dominate my thinking, and I'd like to come back to that in a minute because there's some crossover. But they're taking those stories seriously and trying to understand what is the underlying truth here in light of scripture and what we know to be true about God's actions in the world and who God really is. And I don't know they're completely right on these things. And I would say they would say, we're not saying this is doctrinally what happened. We're just trying to paint with a very broad brush some outlines of ways that we should maybe realize God is at work in the world in ways that we don't even think of. And what about the angelic and the demonic beings that are at work in the world?
Your talking reminds me of Paul, and he's clear to say that certain gods are false gods, and yet at the same time, he says things like, "I notice you have an altar to the unknown God." And in that he ends up, well, basically he says, "Let me tell you about what let me tell you about the true God that's kind of behind that. You misunderstood
Right.
what this God was about. You have this impulse to worship, and you've been worshiping idols. So there's, in other words, part of what Paul is saying is there's something true in your impulse.
Right.
That's right, but we need to redirect it.
Yes. Yeah, and he even quotes several Greek scholars and poets and says, in his quotations, what he is saying is, you have thought of it in this way, but its real meaning is this in light of the gospel. And I think that's what they're trying to get at and they're trying to do. And at least for me, it has been incredibly fruitful spiritually, intellectually, and emotionally, how I deal with the world around me. It's been incredibly beneficial.
I'd like to say a few more things about like coming into this book and my initial reflections. But did you want to say whatever it is you want to say regarding the space trilogy a little bit more at this time, or you want to wait till later?
I will probably bring it up later, but what I will say is it's interesting. C.S. Lewis writes his space trilogy. I don't know exactly when he publishes that, but he was reading Tolkien's works before they were ever published, and he was very familiar with it. It is interesting in the space trilogy, which I think is perhaps Lewis's fullest attempt at trying to explain the nature of all reality in story, and not just one slim article of it, but the whole. He we would call crossover episodes in modern television. He draws from Tolkien and brings him into that world, and as if that is the literal history of England and Europe. And so it's very interesting crossover that I've noticed.
How does he do that? What do you mean?
He specifically references the city of Man, Numenor, that is in Silmarillion, as being this shining kind of pinnacle of humanity in their own powers, but also its collapse and pride, and that since that day, man has never reached the same pinnacles of culture and intellect since that was destroyed.
Well, I know that we need to actually get into the book and some of its themes, and it may be that today we get as far as we get, and then perhaps we have a Silmarillion Part 2 episode eventually. But, it takes time to set the thing up.
Sure.
What I would like to say, though, is for anyone who would like to give it a shot, firstly, feel free to talk to me or talk to Mr. Phillip here, and we'll offer any help that we can. But my experience was, um, it was slow going at first. I mean, it was really slow going. I mean, if you're accustomed to reading, I don't know, a page a minute, I mean, however fast you read, whatever, let's just say a page a minute. Maybe you want to assume that you're slowing down 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
I mean, at first it's very slow going, but it's sort of like that proverbial snowball. I mean, it does all start to come together.
Mhm.
So I'd read a few paragraphs, a page or two, quite literally. I would read a page or two. I would comprehend what I could, but then if there was a name or a place that 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 I that I should understand to understand this paragraph or this section, and I didn't, I looked it up in a Tolkien companion. Or you can, there depending on where you're at. I mean, you can look at like Tolkien Gateway and various things online for quick reference. But a lot of times the significance is in the details. So who people are, how they're related, where people are, how their paths come to cross one another. These details are really, really important. And if you skip over those things or you don't put your mind to understanding them, there will come a point later down the road where you miss the significance of a thing that's otherwise really rich
Yeah.
and present. So what you have in the Silmarillion is a collection of overlapping stories happening in different places and different times, but they come to overlap. And you may get 3 pages of a character here, but then you move to a new character, and maybe you don't see this other character for another 60 pages. But then that character comes back into it, and so you end up having this marvelous web. The process of building the web can feel slow, especially at first, though it gains momentum. And the process of building the web can seem, you don't really appreciate the significance of building it when you've built it. But to use, an analogy that's used for other things sometimes, sometimes you have the back of the blanket that looks like a mess,
Mhm.
but then when you're and it's arduous work and it just looks like chaos. But then you finally finish the thing and you turn it over and it's like, wow, this is a beautiful tapestry or whatever the case may be. So it's my experience with the book and reading through it is it's slow going at first and you don't appreciate the significance of the things that you're learning, but if you stick with it, you will be rewarded.
Mhm. Yeah.
And at by the end, you come to see how it all comes together in a beautiful way, because what you end up seeing, for example, I'm just painting with a broad brush here, but for example, the sins of the father come to be borne out in the sons and the grandsons and the great grandsons. Not in a sort of determinist way per se, but it's just a recognition that our choices matter, and they mean big things down the road. The promises that we make, the decisions we make for ourselves, for our family, that seem small in the moment, come to dominate our lives, come to dominate our legacy in ways that we don't realize. And so anyway, this is the sense in which I mean, give it time, even hundreds of pages, and you see how it comes together. And it's really quite beautiful, but you have to be willing to put in the work. So it really becomes a question of if you want to experience the pleasure that comes from the richness of these characters and these themes, you got to be willing to put the work in. But if you do, my view, you'll be rewarded in a big way.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And um, there were a couple of things that were particularly, if we're thinking of big themes of the book, that have been very important to me. One of them you just touched on is Tolkien for the first time, and he was very helpful in helping me to reconcile how can God be providentially overseeing time and history, And at the same time, we as individuals have volition, the freedom to act and move in that world. And he does it multiple times in the book. The opening creation account, in the creation, in the way he describes it, is that creation is like a piece of music that all of the angelic beings are taking part in, but that the god of all things, Iluvatar, is directing it. And when one angelic being becomes demonic and tries to mar the song, he is always able to weave that discord back into a greater beauty that becomes increasingly rich and more meaningful because of the sorrow that has been woven through it. But then you play that out through the rest of the book, because that it turns out that that was just kind of the overarching narrative. But then what does it actually look like in fine grain? And so these people's lives are all connected with that. And what you begin to realize is, for good and for bad, every action has consequences that echo down through all time, not just in eternity, but in time. And so I need to be aware of the decisions I make will have consequences for ever in some way. And the greater I am in power, strength, wealth, the greater that will be. But everybody has that. And then the other part of that is very helpful is we are born into a flowing stream of all those actions. And there are so many things that are working upon our lives that we don't even know, that are decisions our great great grandparents made that no one in our family remembers. But for whatever reason, that directed the flow of your family's life, your community's life, your society's life. And you're now dealing with those decisions, or those decisions they made that shaped your life in many ways. Your actions in response to that contribute to that ongoing stream for generations to come. So it recognizes that we are all shaped deeply by our context, but we also have our own ability to react to and respond to it in a influence and response relationship. So I think it meshes very well with Four Lines' understanding of free will and Dr. Pigaroli's as well.
So God, from the holes of eternity past, knows precisely what will happen and can pronounce it as such up here. But then in the details, that's true. And at the same time, we are making real and true choices based on our genuine human agency. Yeah.
And the evil of Satan that has marred creation, he is actively turning all of those worst, wicked actions back into his plan. And he is taking the destruction and the horror, and he will weave it back into a design that will eventually turn all that worst abuses and horrors. It will only redound to his glory as his redemptive grace is magnified.
And for purposes of this conversation, I didn't recommend us bringing favorite passages, but if we had done that, there are literally passages in the Silmarillion that talk about that very theme. In a manner of speaking, what the one means for evil, God can mean for good, or cause for good.
He can turn our evil intentions into good.
Yep.
Against our will.
Yep.
And that's what really was the first dawning in my mind when I was first reading this, that I was reading something much deeper than fantasy or fiction as it normally exists, because he was getting at the truth of how is it possible that God could turn the wicked intentions of Jacob's brothers into the good? They meant all of that for evil, but God used their wicked decisions to bring about salvation for Israel. That is unbelievable. So he's taken that idea that he clearly gets that from the Joseph narrative. I think that's where he's getting that sense. And then he just has dwelt upon this, Tolkien has, and meditated on it. And now here's a story to try to explain that to others. What exactly is that?
In terms of the idea of trying to get into this, another piece of advice I would offer is it might be good to try to do it with someone. Um, you'd have to do it with someone who's interested, obviously, who has the patience for it, obviously. But maybe you meet and talk about it once every 2 weeks or something. Because one, it helps with comprehension of just the narrative, but two, it helps with comprehension of themes.
Yeah.
Because one of the things about these matters is, I mean, you can read and read and read and read and not dwell, but at a certain point you need to dwell. Especially when you have something as rich as this. You need to read, but then you need to stop and dwell on what you've read to appreciate what's there.
Yeah, and even if you don't have a friend who would be willing to do that, or whatever, time constraints, this is not a good substitute, but there are a couple of podcasts that deal with Tolkien. Well, not a couple. There are a lot of podcasts out there that deal with Tolkien. I've listened to a couple of them. They are very focused in. They tend to be people who are very, very intensely fans of Tolkien. So, take that for a grain of salt. It can be a little much, but you can find some good stuff out there that's very meaningful.
One thing I would like to mention, big impression for me, living on this side of the scientific revolution, so-called, we see the world rather scientifically. Whether you're young Earth or old Earth creationist or whatever, we just tend to see the world rather scientifically.
Right.
And I'm not hereby saying that I'm taking Tolkien literally, necessarily. But really getting your imagination around something like this may have the effect of expanding your imagination to see, I would say, the world aright. And what I mean by that is the material world is imbued with more spiritual significance than perhaps we realize, just based strictly on a scientific way of looking at the world.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And I remember specifically when I began to realize that this was a problem for me, that I think even though I'm a Christian and I have claimed that God is the creator and that the spirit is a real thing, I'm not a materialist. As a young man, I had been raised in a Christian home and all of those things. And I knew the story of the rainbow. But sometime in my early 20s, I realized that when I saw a rainbow, I immediately in my brain was thinking, well, isn't it pretty when the light hits those water droplets and creates a prism that then flecks into my eyes and appears to be a rainbow? And I said, that's not what a rainbow is. The rainbow doesn't exist until the flood is over. And the rainbow is actually a sign of the covenant between God and man not to destroy the world with a flood again. But we're so inculcated in a materialist understanding of the universe that I never thought of that when I would see the rainbow.
Yeah.
Or if I did, it would only be as kind of an afterthought. And it really restructured the way I started thinking about the world is how often am I foreground in a materialist I don't mean science is not opposed to Christianity, but scientism. There's a scientism to that says the fundamental truth of all things are the material atoms and molecules that make it up. And so Tolkien is very helpful in pushing back against that. And Lewis, in his space trilogy, he goes after scientism, root and branch, and he says that is demonic, and it is a worship of the creation just as much as the worship of the pagan gods was. And what we will find is that those who adhere to a scientism will engage in the same sorts of worship that the pagans did. And I think he's proven to be 100% correct. That's
one other parallel. You mentioned that the Silmarillion is in some ways like the Old Testament. One of the ways in which it's like the Old Testament, maybe the way to do this is this. Lord of the Rings is dark, but it's hopeful. And in the end, things work out very well.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. Not that it's not been out for a while. The Silmarillion is tragic.
Yeah.
There are characters making bad decisions, and you see what the consequences of that is. Sort of like what we see in the Old Testament. We see characters that we follow in the Old Testament, who in the case of the Old Testament are literal people, and they're not just characters of the story. But
Right.
in the Old Testament, we see people making terrible decisions, bad decisions, and we see the consequences of those decisions, which affect them and sometimes affect their families. Even good people make bad decisions, such that, for example, Moses can't enter the promised land. Well, the Silmarillion, it's very much like that. It's more tragedy than comedy.
Yeah, that's right. But like with the Old Testament, so in a tragedy, say Sophocles' Antigone, it's all tragedy, right? It's just destruction. She's moral and virtuous, but it's all destruction. In the Silmarillion and in the Old Testament, and this is where I think there's that connection, is there's lots of tragedy from people doing horrible things. But God's grace still brings beauty out of those tragedies. So we might think of the life of David.
Mm-hmm.
So David is the man after God's own heart. He's venerated for all of Israel history. Up to today, David is venerated by the Jews and by Christians alike. He wrote many of the Psalms. He is the Messiah, comes from David. There's a covenant between God and David. And David wrecks his life and his family's life and his nation. His life is filled with destruction and tragedy from his sin. And everybody gets drawn into it because he's the king, right? Because he's the most powerful and most wealthy. And it shapes the rest of Israelite history. And yet, he is a man after God's own heart. And of all the characters in the Old Testament, we know best what he really thought about God and what his personal relationship with God was like. In fact, we might know more about his personal relationship with God than anybody else in the Bible
Because of the Psalms.
because of the Psalms.
Yeah.
It gives us deep interior thinking about his relationship to God that we resonate with. And it's God's revelation to us. Isn't that fascinating? That relationship is part of God's revelation. And so that's the way the Silmarillion is. It's filled with tragedy, but there's always beauty
Yes.
interwoven with it.
Yes.
And there's good that will eventually come out, but it's always a good that is marbled with sorrow.
So, and there are elements, there are elements of hope throughout that will eventually manifest in what becomes Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Because big picture, unless I've misunderstood or something, the idea is that there were 7 ages in Middle Earth, and you have the age before all the ages, and then you have the first age, which is what most of the Silmarillion is about the first age, partially about the second age, and that's all prefatory to the third age, which is Lord of the Rings. Well, actually, Lord of the Rings is the last of the third age. It's the end of the third age. And then we don't actually ever really see a meaningful development of the fourth through the seventh ages in Tolkien. It was just theoretical. But Lord of the Rings takes place at the end of the third age. But there's all this work leading up to that has moments of incredible tragedy and despair, but it's beautiful in its way. And there are elements of hope throughout that are seeds of what will become the third age.
And I think the good thing about the way in which he deals with hope is that hopes are never completely fulfilled. So there is an assumption, and there's, in many ways, in the way that Scripture does, it tells us of a coming perfection after the end of all things. But there is no attaining that perfection in this time. So all of our best hopes will never be fulfilled in this life. They will only at best receive a partial fulfillment. But that's also very helpful and in some ways encouraging, which is to say, as we are pursuing all of the goals and pursuits that we have in our lives, none of them reach complete fruition. Every work we pursue is marred in some way. And that can become very discouraging unless we recognize that's just part of the nature of a fallen world. But it's also a glimmer of the true perfection we're looking for, which draws us on to that. So that's one of the real benefits of the way in which he deals with hope and tragedy realistically. And that might be I think the other thing you would assume. This book is deeply fantastical, but also one of the most realistic works of literature ever. Which is why Tolkien's fantasy doesn't read like anybody else's fantasy. I never was able to get into anybody else's fantasy works very much at all because they were all inherently unrealistic. And Tolkien's was a real world.
which has geography.
Which has geography.
I think that, you don't know how a conversation is going to go until you get into it. I would like for us to look at the book itself, to get into the book itself, but I don't know that we have the time to sufficiently work through some of those themes and some of those characters. We've spoken here, instead of in particular ways, we've spoken more about the book in a meta analysis. So I think it would be best, if it's okay with you, to push our conversation about some of the details, some of the characters, some of the themes of the Silmarillion for a later conversation. And we can just let this one have been about the idea of the Silmarillion in the broadest sense,
Sure.
as opposed to getting into the details. That said, it may be that you have some questions for me about the Silmarillion, or my thought on this or that that's relevant to what we've talked about, that I've not answered, that you wondered about,
Okay.
that I would let you ask now.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that details later, but in terms
Sure.
of the macro, do you have any questions for me? I guess.
Yeah, I think I
Because
was.
I've been asking questions of you.
I see. What do you think is the? Well, let's put it this way. So, if it is a tough haul, what was the first sign for you that this was going to be worth the work, and what would come out of it that would be particularly rich and engaging? So you would keep working at it.
There's more than one creation account in it, which sort of goes with, well, not sort of, it goes with Genesis, because you got Genesis 1 and then you got Genesis 2, and they're not contradictory creation accounts, they complement one another. But you read those creation accounts and you're trucking along, but then you get into the second creation account and it gets to get a little bit bewildering, because you're thinking, what? I just read this. Why am I reading this again? I don't quite understand. Because you're getting your head around, what is this thing? And that might be what we do next time, is to lay out what exactly is happening with each of these parts. But that second time, you paint with a really broad brush the first time. The second creation account, though, you begin to introduce specific Ainur, and you begin to talk about their names and their various relations, and what they are for, and you start to get some detail that you didn't have before. And it on the one hand, it's introducing you, the story is introducing you to these characters. On the other hand, there's an extent to which it kind of expects you to know who they are.
Mhm.
So it's not sort of babying you into this world. It's just here it is. So it's not here's this character. Let me tell you about this character. It's more like, this character did this and they did that, and it just assumes that you know. So you have to you begin to get in the details. And then if you can make it past that, then you begin to get into the creation, and to the created order itself, as opposed to the idea of the created order through the songs. And then there are some cosmological ideas that are just different from how we're used to thinking, and it can be easy to get lost in there. So your question was, at what point did it start to become sort of worth? I suppose for me, it's after you're tempted to get lost. Um, so at first it's exciting, and then you get lost, or you're tempted to get lost, really once you get to the story of Feanor, which is a little way down. It's a little way down the way.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a little way
It
down.
becomes a little bit more of a traditional narrative at that point.
It becomes a little bit more of a traditional narrative, but also you're slowly beginning to see why all that stuff that came before is relevant to Feanor. In a manner of speaking, the world of Feanor, like this is our world.
Right.
This is the world we live in. The stuff before Feanor, this is a part of the prehistoric past, and it can be abstract and hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
That said, what I have found is that if you can get yourself to wrap your head around it, it's like forcing your mind to go through that exercise, digs creases in your brain, in a manner of speaking, in your mind, that help you to make sense of real things.
Yeah.
So, in other words, if there are things in the scriptures that you know in a theoretical way, but you've had difficulty making sense of it, this story, which among other things is supposed to be its form is pre-modern, it helps you to see a way in which this thing could be true.
Yeah.
Or how it could be meaningful, or how it's more than just abstract.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to imagine, well, I don't mean to say that in terms of the idea that it's not true. I mean, it is true. If you study history and you study different people, there are some groups of people who don't have certain assumptions in their epistemic framework. They just don't have it.
Right.
But they do have other ideas in their epistemic framework. So there are cultures in the world that don't really have a concept for atheism.
Right.
That's not even in their epistemic framework. They can't even comprehend what that idea would even be like.
Right.
But vice versa, a lot of people today don't have within, including myself, this scientism problem we have living on this side of the scientific revolution. There are ways of conceiving of the world that just it's not in our epistemic framework, and we've not done the hard work to get it in there. Well, this book may have the effect of helping you get that in there, which would have been true to Christians living hundreds of years ago.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And as I'm thinking about it, I didn't know exactly which question you were going to. I didn't know the question you were going to ask, obviously. So I had to think about it. But as I think about it a little bit more, it's not. It begins to make sense before Feanor, because you have the creation of the various, or it becomes to be meaningful before Feanor. You have the creation of the various types of creatures. You have elves, and you have men, and you have dwarves, and not in that order. And then you have different sorts of elves, and they're taking a pilgrimage, and then Feanor comes after that. But all of this is laying groundwork for and Feanor is the first one who just really breaks your heart.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I'm kind of rambling all over.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think the other part for me was going in there looking for Lord of the Rings characters.
Oh, yeah.
It was a kind of a prequel in that way. If that's the way you think of it until you get into it. And you're like, I'm not recognizing anything here. It is completely foreign. And then eventually Galadriel shows up, and you're like, oh, well, she was kind of a minor character in Lord of the Rings as time. And then you hear Sauron, but it just takes a long time. And the people well, at least when I was young, I was really wanting to find out more about Gandalf. Doesn't show up till the very end of the book. And he's only barely there. You do get some really interesting context for the wizards. And some other things that are very helpful about who is Aragorn. And that it does. I would also was it true for you? I don't know if you had time to go back and read the Lord of the Rings since then, but it really imbues the Lord of the Rings story with a lot more gravitas.
I'm looking forward to reading Lord of the Rings again someday, in light of having been through the Silmarillion 3 times.
Yeah.
Now I read it once.
Yeah.
And I've listened to it twice.
Yeah.
And I've slowly begun to do some of the standalone stories. That have been published in the last, I don't know, 15 or 20 years, that are parts of stories in the Silmarillion, but expanded.
I would compare it, and I know this may not be, I don't mean this in a derogatory way. I would compare it to, in some ways, though, returning to the Gospels after having really got my head around the Old Testament for the first time.
Yeah.
Because there's all these things going on in Jesus's life and in his speeches and in his proverbs that it means something when you first read it. But when you have a full grasp, a good grasp of the Old Testament, you come back to them and you go, "Oh, I got
It's much richer than you realized.
yeah, yeah." I had no idea that when he said that, he was referencing all this stuff from the Old Testament. And everybody in his crowd, that's why everybody responds so, you know, so bizarrely as it would seem to us.
Yeah.
It's because they all knew what he was saying.
That's right. That's right. Well, no, I suppose I interpreted your question, like, at what point was it like, "Oh, man, this is really starting to hit," you know?
Mhm.
And, I think it's probably Feanor.
Yeah.
I initially, I was into it at first, and then I got lost, and then I sort of gave up. And then when I came back to it, I trudged through that part I got lost in. But then there's proverbial light on the other side,
Yeah.
and you begin to see the creation of all these different types of peoples,
Mhm.
but then individual characters emerge within those peoples, and it's the stuff we're talking about. They make decisions that are it's like David, like you said, it's they're celebrated and they're hugely momentous and there's a lot of good there and it's also heartbreaking all at the same time.
Yeah.
And all the themes that you have in the history of man and in the scriptures, you have all those themes here.
Right.
And so you get to see these things played out in a different kind of way. And this is one of the great things about any sort of narrative, whether it's narrative based on historical fact or narrative based on fiction. But good narrative, whether fictional or real, is not a good narrative is nonetheless true.
Yeah.
So even something that's fictional can be true in the sense that it's true to the world as it really is.
Right.
So you can learn to empathize with these characters and suffer with these characters and celebrate with these characters, but it reveals something to you about yourself. It reveals things to you about the world, and it allows you to imagine what you would do if you were in that particular situation, and so may have the effect of helping you to avoid pitfalls that you didn't know to look out for, except for the fact that you walked in the shoes of this character or that character. And that's why good fiction is so important because it does let you walk in the shoes of people, and then you can see what happens when you make those decisions in those shoes, and you can be avoided from not doing this or doing that or whatever. Well, I think we need to end this conversation unless you had anything else you wanted to mention.
No, I think that's good. I appreciate that idea of the real world and fiction. I've become very aware of how hard that is to do based on my reading of fiction, and it's surprising where that can come up in some cases. And maybe one day we'll talk about uh, my son's favorite series of books, the Hank the Cowdog books, because when he first was introduced to those, I was like, oh, it's a kid's book, whatever. But as I became aware, I became convinced this guy has to be a Christian who's the author. This is the most realistic world, even though it's a farcical world. It's the most realistic world I've seen in modern children's literature and I don't know whatever. And sure enough, I found out later on he was a Christian. So, but it's exact things that are going on, which are the world can be real even if it's fictional, and Tolkien did that beautifully. So,
Well, I've enjoyed this conversation on the Silmarillion. Like I said, I didn't know quite how it would go. So we'll have to, if you want, pick it up and we'll get into more of the details at some later time.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for being a part of this conversation. Feel free to ask questions of us if you have them in the comment feature or through email, whatever the case may be. Thanks a lot.